Flight attendant calls security on black man, but he's actually the airline's top investor. They say you never forget the moment your world gets flipped upside down. For one man, it happened 35,000 feet in the air. Imagine stepping onto a plane, expecting nothing more than a smooth ride across the country, only to be humiliated, threatened, and nearly thrown off, all because of the color of your skin. But here's the twist. This man wasn't just a regular passenger. He was the airline's top investor, a powerhouse behind the scenes, with the clout to bring an entire empire to its knees. Intrigued? Buckle up, because this story is about to take you on a ride you'll never forget. Jerome Carter pulled his charcoal grey suitcase through the bustling terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport. The overhead speakers chimed repeatedly, echoing announcements of arrivals and departures. Delta Airlines, Flight 773 to Los Angeles International Airport, was set to board in just under an hour, but Jerome was in no rush. He loved airports, these hubs of human activity that pulsed with excitement, anxiety, and anticipation. People from every walk of life intersected here, all brought together by the shared desire or need to travel somewhere else, to be someone else, or to do something else. The day had begun in an ordinary fashion, albeit with a few small annoyances. He was nearly late leaving his Manhattan condo because he'd lingered too long on a conference call about an upcoming board meeting for a major investment project. He also had to rearrange some last minute details with his personal assistant, Melissa, who insisted on double-checking that he had everything he needed for his trip. Now, walking through Terminal 4, he was grateful for her thoroughness. He felt relaxed, excited for this journey, a quick flight to Los Angeles, a meeting with the Delta Airlines executive board, and then a short vacation he felt he richly deserved. Jerome wore a crisp navy blue suit that fit his tall, athletic frame perfectly. At 38, he had established himself as a major player in the investment world. Early on, he had joined a prestigious Wall Street firm, swiftly climbing the ranks. His successes were legendary in the finance sector, eventually leading him to forge partnerships with globally recognized corporations. One of these partnerships was with Delta Airlines, where he was not just a shareholder, but the single largest private investor. His strategic insights had propelled Delta's expansions into new markets and earned him a seat at their highest-level negotiations. Most people in the airport paid him little mind as he walked by. He looked like any other businessman, though upon closer inspection one might notice the subtle confidence in his stride. The watch around his wrist was a Cartier, a gift he'd purchased to celebrate closing a major deal a few years ago. His polished shoes made smooth clicks on the polished marble floor. Despite his presence and wealth, Jerome was not one to advertise his success with gaudy displays. But he also never shied away from looking his best. He stopped briefly at a cafe to grab a bottle of water. As he waited in line, he noticed a small child tugging at his mother's purse, excitedly pointing at the planes visible through the large floor-to-ceiling windows. Jerome smiled. He remembered what it was like to be that child wide-eyed, consumed by the wonder of flight. He'd been that kid once, going on a rare family trip from his hometown in Ohio to see relatives in California. His parents had saved for months to afford that flight. He'd never forgotten how the airplane seemed magical. Jerome paid for his water and made his way toward the gate. Over the intercom, a crisp voice announced, "Delta Airlines Flight 773 to Los Angeles International Airport will begin the pre-boarding process in 15 minutes. Passengers requiring special assistance may approach the gate." He glanced at his boarding pass, noticing he was in seat 2. A first class, as always. The flight would be quick and comfortable. The real challenge was the meeting scheduled with some of Delta's top executives right after landing. Though Jerome technically had the upper hand given his standing as their biggest private investor, he believed in collaboration over intimidation. Over the years, he'd garnered respect by offering constructive feedback and taking a genuine interest in the airline's welfare. However, not everyone in the company was thrilled about an influential outsider, especially a self-made black man, having such power over their operations. Jerome had learned early on that prejudice, especially in the corporate world, could be subtle and insidious. As he eased into one of the gate's waiting area seats, he sipped his water and exchanged a few text messages with Melissa, confirming a dinner reservation at a top Los Angeles restaurant. Then he closed his eyes for a moment, reflecting on his journey from a curious child on a plane for the first time to an influential figure in global aviation. Life was beautifully unpredictable, but sometimes it could also be cruel. Little did Jerome know that in the next few hours he would face an ordeal that would test his patience, dignity, and even his faith in humanity. And it would start with a casual misunderstanding, one that would cascade into a moment of explosive tension, a moment that would shake him to his core. Boarding began, and Jerome rose from his seat, joining the first-class line. A flight attendant, a slim, middle-aged woman with short blonde hair, neatly combed in a classic crew style, stood at the airplane door, greeting passengers. Her name tag read, Helen. Her uniform was crisp, her smile practiced. She was handing out small paper menus for the in-flight meal as people stepped in. Jerome entered the Boeing 737, noticing that the overhead compartments were already beginning to fill. "Good afternoon," he said, extending a polite nod to Helen. She paused momentarily, just a fraction of a second too long, before returning his greeting with a clipped "hello" and handing him the menu. Jerome, skilled at reading micro-expressions, caught the slight shift in her eyes. He shrugged it off. She was probably having a long day. Flight attendants often had to deal with tough schedules and demanding passengers. He found seat 2A, stowed his carry-on, and settled in. He loved the window seat, especially in first class, where there was ample space. The business traveler in seat 2B was already glued to a laptop, typing furiously as if the plane had already taken off. Jerome offered a friendly nod, but the other man barely acknowledged him. Probably a busy executive with deadlines to meet, Jerome thought as he buckled his seatbelt. Helen came through first class, offering glasses of orange juice or champagne. Jerome politely opted for orange juice. Again, he noticed her glance linger on him, as if she were assessing him. Had he done something to set her off? He brushed aside the thought. Maybe she recognized him from one of those Forbes or Fortune magazine features. That happens sometimes, though not as frequently as one might imagine. Or maybe she was just flustered. She moved on, distributing drinks to the other passengers. The hustle of boarding continued, punctuated by overhead announcements about storing carry-ons and turning off electronic devices. Once the final passengers filed into economy, the flight attendants prepared for takeoff. Jerome settled in, reviewing some documents on his tablet, anticipating the upcoming meeting in LA. He felt a sense of pride thinking about how far he had come. His father had been a middle school teacher and his mother a nurse. They had raised Jerome and his siblings with the mantra that hard work, determination, and kindness could pave a path to success. They were right. He looked around the cabin. A father and daughter sat across from him, the little girl excitedly bouncing in her seat, asking dozens of questions about seatbelts, plane wings, and snacks. The father patiently answered, smiling. Next to them, a well-dressed woman scrolled through her phone, her posture elegant and composed, perhaps another business mogul or an actress. Jerome loved imagining the stories each passenger carried. Airplanes brought everyone into the same metal tube, equalized in altitude, if not in class. The engine's hum rose in pitch as the plane began taxiing. Jerome watched out the window, seeing the runway lights pass by in a blur. Suddenly, that weightless rush, the plane lifted, and Manhattan's skyline fell away beneath them. There was always a spark of childlike wonder in Jerome's heart at takeoff. No matter how many times he flew, the sensation still thrilled him. About 20 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign blinked off, and the flight attendants began their in-flight service. Helen and another flight attendant, a friendly man named Sam, worked the first-class cabin, taking meal orders and handing out warm towels. Jerome noticed a difference in how Helen interacted with certain passengers. With the father-daughter duo across the aisle, she was warm and gracious, bending down to talk to the little girl, complimenting her braids and promising extra cookies. But when she came to Jerome, her manner turned abruptly curt. "What would you like for your meal, sir?" she asked, voice clipped. Her eyes flicked to his tablet, then back to him, as though she were suspicious of what he was doing. Jerome smiled politely. "I believe the menu had a herb-crusted chicken with mashed potatoes option?" "I'll have that, please." Helen jotted it down without a word of acknowledgement and moved on. Sam, close behind with the beverage cart, gave Jerome a reassuring smile. Jerome exhaled. Maybe Helen was simply having a bad day. Or maybe she'd had a negative encounter with another passenger earlier. He decided not to dwell on it. There was no point in jumping to conclusions about her attitude. When Helen returned with the meal, she placed the tray in front of Jerome with a distinct lack of care, causing his water glass to slosh precariously. Instinctively, Jerome steadied it, glancing up at her in mild annoyance. "You need something else, sir?" she asked, almost challenging him. Jerome hesitated. "No, thank you. I'm all set." She nodded stiffly and continued down the aisle. Jerome felt a flicker of irritation. As a paying passenger and, ironically, a major investor in the airline, he certainly expected a baseline of politeness. But life had taught him that some people carried biases they barely recognized. Over the years, he'd encountered everything from microaggressions to blatant racism in boardrooms, hotels, and social events. He'd learned not to let it shake him, but each instance left its little mark, a faint reminder that prejudice was alive and well. He ate his meal slowly, trying to focus on the flavors. The herb-crusted chicken was nicely seasoned, the mashed potatoes creamy, but the enjoyment was dampened by the tension in the air. He tried to distract himself by reading the latest financial news on his tablet, but he kept glancing at Helen, noticing how her interactions with the other passengers were far more relaxed and congenial than with him. "Excuse me, sir, would you mind putting your tablet away for a moment?" "We're collecting trays," Helen said abruptly, reappearing at his shoulder. Jerome looked at her, eyebrow raised. "Sure," he said, pressing the button to power it down. He carefully placed his tablet in the seat pocket so he could hand over the half-finished meal tray. She leaned in a little closer than necessary, her gaze flicking to the seat pocket. Then she stepped away. Jerome wondered if he was imagining things. Why was she hovering? His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He discreetly took it out to see a text from Melissa, who had just confirmed that the board members were excited to meet with him. "See you at LAX," she wrote. Jerome's chest warmed with the sense of pride. He tapped a quick response, then placed the phone back in his pocket, determined to ignore the flight attendant's sour attitude. After all, the flight was only a few hours, and he had bigger things on his mind, like the future direction of Delta's corporate strategies. Little did he know, this was only the prelude to something far more unsettling. As the plane cruised above the clouds, the cabin lights dimmed slightly to let passengers rest or enjoy the in-flight entertainment. Sam, the other flight attendant, passed through with a snack basket. "Would you care for some chips or a cookie?" he offered brightly, stopping at Jerome's row. Jerome smiled. "A cookie would be great. Thank you." "Of course." Sam handed him a packaged cookie and gave a polite nod before moving on. Helen was nowhere to be seen for a while. Jerome took the chance to close his eyes, leaning his head back against the seat. He had a knack for power napping during flights, and with the busy schedule awaiting him in Los Angeles, every minute of rest mattered. But just as he began to drift, he felt a sudden jolt. Someone had bumped his seat. He opened his eyes to find Helen leaning over him, her expression borderline hostile. She was adjusting something in the overhead bin. A pang of confusion shot through Jerome. Why would she need to do that above his seat right now? "Oh, sorry," she said, though her tone suggested anything but. She made a show of rearranging a single coat hanging in the bin before slamming it shut. Jerome tried for a smile, or at least a civil nod, but she brushed past him. The seat to-be passenger glanced over, eyebrows raised in silent question. Jerome shrugged. It was strange. Yes, but maybe Helen was just hyper-stressed. Half an hour went by without incident. The in-flight entertainment was showing a comedic movie. Jerome watched with mild interest, though his mind kept drifting to the upcoming meeting. He had to present his analysis on how Delta could improve route efficiency in underperforming markets. His suggestions were bold, some might say radical, but Jerome knew the airline had the potential to capture greater market share if they embraced innovation. Then he noticed Helen again. She stood at the front of first class, whispering to another flight attendant who occasionally shot glances in Jerome's direction. Jerome's stomach churned with discomfort. Were they talking about him? He tried to dismiss the paranoia. It could be anything, but the hush-hush glances continued for another 10 minutes. Finally, Sam approached Jerome's row, his expression tense. "Sir, is everything all right?" Sam asked quietly, bending down so only Jerome could hear. Jerome frowned. "Everything's fine." "Why do you ask?" Sam looked uncomfortable. "Helen mentioned that you might be acting suspiciously. She said she saw you with multiple electronic devices, and you seemed agitated." Jerome blinked in disbelief. He glanced at seat 2B, who was once again typing furiously on his laptop, clearly using more than one device. Meanwhile, plenty of other passengers in first class also had smartphones, tablets, or laptops. "That's strange," Jerome said slowly. "I'm just using my phone and tablet like everyone else." Sam exhaled, relief flooding his features. "Yes, of course. I told her it's normal for business travelers." "You were just reading and texting, right?" Jerome nodded. "Exactly. Is there a problem with that?" "No, sir," Sam said, shaking his head. "Not at all. I'm so sorry to bother you. Please ignore this. If you need anything, let me know." He gave Jerome a professional nod and moved on. Jerome felt an uneasy sensation in the pit of his stomach. Why would Helen report him as suspicious? What was behind this? He looked down at his attire, a well-tailored suit, tasteful watch, well-groomed appearance. Hardly the look of a troublemaker or threat. Then a bitter possibility stirred in his mind. Could it be racial profiling? Jerome wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, but the evidence was mounting. Helen's hostility, her microaggressions, and now her baseless accusation. Anger flared within him, but he tried to keep it in check. He had spent a lifetime proving he belonged in places where others assumed he did not. This was no different. And yet it stung, especially happening on a Delta flight, an airline in which he had poured a significant portion of his capital, vision, and faith. Jerome spent the next half hour replaying the flight attendant's comments in his head. Could he nip this issue in the bud somehow? Perhaps a calm conversation with Helen would clarify everything. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that her behavior might not be an isolated moment of stress. It might be a window into her broader prejudices. He was just about to get up and visit the lavatory when Helen approached again, standing squarely in the aisle next to his seat. "Sir, one need to speak with you," she stated, arms folded. Jerome's patience was wearing thin, but he kept his composure. "Of course. Is there a problem?" She pressed her lips together. You tell me. You've been fidgeting with your phone and tablet, and I saw you texting repeatedly. Is there a reason you're so nervous? His eyes narrowed. I'm a business traveler. I'm working. That's what I'm doing. A flicker of something defiance, disdain crossed her face. Well, I've dealt with passengers like you before, trying to skirt the rules, thinking they can do whatever they want in first class. Jerome felt a surge of disbelief. Passengers like me? What does that mean? Passengers, she repeated, adding pointed emphasis, who caused disturbances. There it was, the coded language, the dog whistle. He remained calm. I haven't caused any disturbance. I've been sitting quietly, eating my meal, and using my devices when allowed. If you're uncomfortable for any reason, I invite you to check with other passengers or your colleague, Sam. Helen set her jaw. I'm watching you. She pivoted abruptly and stalked off toward the galley. Several nearby passengers had overheard the conversation, their eyes wide with confusion. Jerome felt his pulse thrum in his temples. He took a deep breath, striving for composure. The last thing he needed was a mid-flight confrontation. However, he also refused to let this go unchecked. He decided to speak with Sam or even the lead flight attendant if necessary, but before he could get out of his seat, Helen reappeared with a scowl. Let me see your ID. Jerome stiffened. Excuse me, I need to verify your identification, she said coldly. We have the right to do that if we suspect fraudulent activity. Jerome's heart pounded. Fraudulent activity? Are you serious? Her gaze flicked up and down his suit. Quite. At this point, the tension was palpable enough that seat 2B finally pulled his attention away from his laptop. What's going on? The man murmured. Helen ignored seat 2B, focusing on Jerome. Your ID, sir. Jerome's rational mind warred with his growing anger. He knew his rights. Legally, a flight attendant cannot forcibly check a passenger's ID mid-flight unless there is a specific security concern, and they usually handle it discreetly, involving the flight's captain or air marshal if there is a real threat. This was unprofessional at best, and potentially malicious at worst. I'm not handing you my identification without a valid reason, he said quietly. If you suspect something criminal, you should involve the appropriate authorities. Otherwise, you're harassing me. Helen's cheeks reddened. You're refusing a flight crew member's request? Unless you give me an actual reason, Jerome answered. Helen inhaled sharply. Fine. We'll handle this the hard way. She pivoted and walked briskly down the aisle. Jerome's adrenaline surged, his heart hammering. He had seen viral videos of such confrontations where a simple prejudice spiraled into an overblown scenario, sometimes ending with the passenger being escorted off the plane, or worse. He could not let that happen, not when he'd done nothing wrong. But what if security was waiting at the gate, ready to pounce on him? The thought made him tremble with anger and frustration. This wasn't just about one rude flight attendant. This was about a system that often believed the worst about people who looked like him. A system that might automatically side with a flight attendant's word over his. A system that might not even realize who he was in relation to the airline's ownership. And even if they did, prejudice could blind them to everything else. Just as Jerome was about to stand and find a supervisor, Sam rushed over. Sir, please stay calm, he whispered urgently. Helen is talking to the captain right now. She claims you're a security risk. Jerome let out a shaky breath. This is unbelievable. Sam swallowed hard. I saw how she's been treating you, and I don't agree with it. But the captain has to take her report seriously. I've done nothing wrong, Jerome insisted. Can I speak to the captain myself? Sam looked torn. I'll see what I can do, but Helen is the senior flight attendant on this route, and she's known to be strict. I never imagined she'd go this far. Jerome felt a rush of gratitude that Sam at least recognized the injustice. But the situation was dire. If the captain believed Helen, they could land the plane prematurely or have law enforcement waiting at LAX. Jerome's pulse pounded with an unsettling mix of anger and anxiety. He spoke carefully. "Sam, I appreciate your honesty. I need you to let the captain know I am more than willing to talk. I'll show him my ID. I'll answer any questions. And I want to file a formal complaint about Helen's conduct." Sam nodded. "All right. I'll relay your message. Stay in your seat for now, please." Jerome sank back, exhaling. This was worse than any boardroom confrontation he'd experienced. When dealing with corporate negotiations, there was a logic to the process: numbers, data, strategies. Here, it was a personal vendetta fueled by prejudice, and those illusions of power were stacked against him in a place where he had limited recourse. He checked the flight information on the screen embedded in front of him. They still had about 2 hours left until they landed at LAX. 2 long hours. Jerome tried to busy himself, glancing at the half-finished financial reports on his tablet. But every few minutes, he glanced up, scanning the aisle for any sign of Helen or Sam. He could barely focus on the words in front of him. Eventually, Helen emerged from the cockpit, wearing a smug expression. She locked eyes with Jerome, then leaned in to whisper something to a uniformed flight officer who was stepping out of the cockpit as well. The officer nodded, his gaze darting toward Jerome before returning to Helen. A few seconds later, they parted, and Helen headed for the galley. Jerome's chest tightened. He watched the flight officer approach. The man was tall, with silver-grey hair and a serious expression. He introduced himself quietly as First Officer Daniels. "Sir, I'd like to speak with you briefly," Daniels said in a low voice, crouching beside Jerome's seat. "We've received a report from the cabin crew about concerning behavior. I understand this might be a misunderstanding, so I'd like to hear your side." Jerome expelled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thank you. I appreciate the chance to speak. My name is Jerome Carter. I'm a frequent flyer, and I was using my phone and tablet for work. The flight attendant, Helen, has made multiple comments implying I'm suspicious or a disturbance. I haven't raised my voice, haven't threatened anyone, haven't violated any rules." He paused, then decided honesty was the best path. "Look, I'm also a major shareholder, an investor in Delta Airlines. I have an important meeting in Los Angeles with the company's executives. This entire situation is humiliating and unprovoked." First Officer Daniels blinked, clearly taken aback. He studied Jerome's face. "I see," he said finally. "Well, Mr. Carter, as First Officer, I have to ensure the safety of everyone on board, including you. Let me speak with the captain and see what we can do to defuse this situation. The last thing we want is an incident." Jerome nodded. "Thank you. I'm more than willing to cooperate with any reasonable request." Daniels gave him a polite, if tense, nod and rose, heading back to the cockpit. Jerome could almost feel the stares of the other passengers in first class. Many of them had witnessed bits and pieces of the confrontation, and though no one said anything outright, the tension was apparent. Chapter 8. The warning from Sam shortened to 500 words. Jerome was on the verge of getting up to speak with the supervisor when Sam hurried over, voice low and urgent. "Sir, please remain calm," he whispered. "Helen just went to the cockpit. She's telling the captain you might be a security risk." Shock rippled through Jerome. He had been sitting quietly, doing nothing to warrant such a claim. Sam glanced around nervously. "I've never seen her act this extreme before. She's known to be strict, but this is different. I don't want you to get in trouble for something you didn't do." Jerome inhaled, forcing composure. "This is absurd," he said, feeling his pulse thud in his ears. "All I did was use my phone and tablet, like everyone else here." Despite his indignation, a thread of fear coiled inside him. He was well aware of how quickly misunderstandings, especially those colored by prejudice, could spiral out of control. Sam nodded, lowering his voice further. I believe you, but she's senior to me, and if she's telling the captain you're agitated or refusing orders, it might be taken seriously. If the pilot believes her, the crew could contact authorities before we land. Jerome's stomach turned. He glanced around the first-class cabin. A few curious passengers peeked in his direction, sensing tension but not yet aware of the full story. Jerome's mind raced, recalling news reports of incidents where travelers were forcibly removed, sometimes violently. He was not about to let that happen, especially since he had done absolutely nothing wrong. Sam, please let the captain know I'm cooperative, he said. I've offered to show my ID. I just want this resolved. Sam gave a quick nod. I will. Hang tight, sir. I'll do what I can. With that, he hurried off, presumably to intercept Helen's story with the captain. Jerome exhaled, leaning his head against the seat. No matter how much personal or professional success he had achieved, moments like these reminded him he was not immune to prejudice. Growing anxiety prickled through him. He had an important meeting upon arrival, one that impacted both his reputation and that of Delta Airlines. Now the flight attendant was poised to paint him as a threat. Minutes dragged by, each feeling heavier than the last. Jerome noticed Helen step out of the cockpit, the triumphant glint in her eyes rattling him. She exchanged hushed words with another crew member, shooting dark looks his way as if plotting the next move. Jerome tried to steady his breathing. If the captain sided with her, security might greet him on the jet bridge, or worse. The plane could make an early landing. He gripped his armrest, reminding himself of his father's advice, no matter the adversity, stay calm. You can't control their actions, but you can control your own. Still, the knot in his stomach only tightened. If Helen refused to back down, Jerome's entire life could be upended in one flight. 5 minutes later, Captain Aguilar returned. Her expression was tight. Mr. Carter, she began softly. I've spoken with Helen at length. She insists you made her uncomfortable, though the specifics of her allegations are unclear. However, you've provided valid ID, and Sam has confirmed you haven't exhibited any threatening behavior. I see no reason to remove you from this flight or take any further action. Relief washed over Jerome, but it was mixed with lingering anger. Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your judgment, but I can't just let this go. Helen's behavior has been discriminatory and harassing from the moment I stepped on board. Captain Aguilar nodded slowly. I understand. If you wish to file a formal complaint, you have every right to do so. For now, I'll ask that everyone remain calm. We still have over an hour until we land in LAX. Let's try to make the rest of this flight as smooth as possible. Jerome detected the hint of weariness in her tone. This was the last thing a pilot wanted: cabin conflict. He appreciated her sense of professionalism. Understood. She gave him a polite smile and retreated to the cockpit. Jerome took a long, unsteady breath. He noticed Helen standing in the galley, glaring at him. The situation hadn't ended, it had merely paused. He resolved to gather witnesses and evidence once they landed. He would not let an incident like this be swept under the rug. The flight had about 40 minutes remaining when turbulence suddenly rattled the plane. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, advising everyone to remain seated. Flight attendants hurried to collect loose items and ensure passengers were buckled up. Jerome braced himself, feeling the plane shudder as it cut through rough air. He didn't mind turbulence. After so many flights, he'd grown accustomed to it. But each bump underscored how vulnerable everyone was at this altitude. Helen made one final pass through the aisles, checking seatbelts, but she gave Jerome's row only a cursory glance before moving on. The tension remained thick. The father whispered to his daughter that everything was fine, just a little bumpy. The child pressed her face to the window, enthralled by the roiling clouds. Then the plane jolted more violently. A startled yelp came from somewhere in coach. A few overhead bins popped open and items tumbled out. Helen hurried toward the back, presumably to assist with the unexpected dislodgings. Suddenly, chaos erupted. The father across the aisle realized his daughter's bag had spilled, and small toys rolled into the aisle. She tried to unbuckle. "No, honey," the father insisted, fumbling to pick the toys up from his seat to keep her buckled safely. Jerome, who had sharper reach from his angle, stretched out carefully to grab a small action figure rolling toward him. As he did, Helen came racing back up the aisle, presumably to get the flight attendant seated for the turbulence. She tripped over Jerome's outstretched arm, losing her balance. She let out a shriek. A collective gasp swept through the nearby rows. Helen staggered, and Sam rushed forward to help her. The turbulence shook the plane again, sending Helen stumbling into the galley where she banged her shoulder. Jerome instinctively tried to steady her, but he couldn't reach. In seconds, she was on the floor, glaring up at him like a wounded animal. "You did that on purpose," she spat. Jerome's eyes widened in disbelief. "I was just helping pick up a child's toy. You tripped." She shoved Sam's arm away and stood. "I've had enough of this," she seethed. "You've been trying to cause trouble this whole flight. Now you're physically endangering the crew. That's it. I'm calling security to meet us at the gate." Jerome's stomach plummeted. "You're insane." "I did nothing but try to help. Shut it," she practically screamed, drawing horrified looks from passengers. "I'm reporting you. You'll be escorted off this plane in handcuffs." The father across the aisle intervened, voice trembling. "Ma'am, please, he was just helping my daughter. This is a misunderstanding." Helen shot him a furious glare. "Stay out of it." She whipped out her intercom phone, ignoring the man's pleas, and radioed the flight deck. Jerome heard fragments of her frantic report. "Aggressive passenger. Physical contact. Demands removal." The entire time, she kept her eyes locked on Jerome, hatred flickering in them. Jerome's head spun. This was madness. Seat 2B watched, jaw dropped. Sam looked torn between duty and fairness. The father tried again to explain the situation, but Helen stormed away, barking at passengers to remain in their seats. Jerome felt his heart pounding so hard, he wondered if the entire cabin could hear it. One part of him wanted to leap up and shout the truth. Another part insisted he remain calm. At 35,000 feet, any sign of resistance could be twisted against him. He sank back into his seat, mind reeling with the possible nightmare waiting at LAX armed security, news cameras, a public scene that would overshadow everything else. He forced himself to take measured breaths, repeating a mantra he'd learned through years of adversity. "I am in control of my own reactions, if nothing else." He looked around, seeing pity or shock on the faces of nearby passengers. The father across the aisle murmured, "I'll vouch for you. This is ridiculous." Jerome forced a grateful smile, though his mind churned. He was no ordinary passenger. He was a top investor in Delta Airlines. If the airline didn't handle this properly, the repercussions would be massive, both legally and financially. Helen had no idea who she was dealing with, but even if she did, would it matter to someone so consumed by prejudice? The turbulence eased as the plane made its final approach to LAX. The seatbelt sign stayed illuminated, and the flight attendants, minus Helen, hurried to secure the cabin for landing. Captain Aguilar announced that the flight would be touching down shortly, with instructions for all passengers to remain seated. Jerome felt every muscle in his body tense, bracing not just for touchdown, but for the chaos that might follow. He watched the landscape come into view, Los Angeles sprawl, endless freeways, hazy skies. Normally, seeing the city excited him. This time, his stomach twisted in knots. As the plane's wheels screeched onto the runway, Jerome closed his eyes. offering a silent prayer for patience and justice. He exhaled shakily, knowing that in minutes the plane would dock at the gate, and he would have to face whatever awaited him. When the plane taxied to the gate and the seatbelt sign finally blinked off, Helen announced in a stern tone, "All passengers, please remain seated for a moment. Law enforcement will be boarding to address a situation with one of our passengers." A chorus of alarmed whispers rippled through the cabin. Sam's face was pale as he looked at Jerome apologetically. The father across the aisle spoke loud enough for everyone in first class to hear. "This is an injustice." "He didn't do anything. He was helping my daughter." Helen ignored him, crossing her arms. The door opened, and two uniformed airport police officers, followed by a Delta security representative, stepped onto the plane. Jerome felt a pounding in his chest. This can't be happening, he thought, his composure fraying. The security representative, her name tag read Mona Fraser, looked professional and serious. She conferred briefly with Helen, who gestured at Jerome. Then Mona, followed by the police officers, moved down the aisle until they stood beside Jerome's seat. "Sir," Mona said politely, "we need you to step off the aircraft with us to discuss an incident reported by a crew member." Jerome swallowed hard. He scanned the faces of the other passengers. Most wore expressions of shock or confusion. A few were filming with their phones. He steadied himself. "I'll go with you, but please understand I did nothing wrong." One of the officers nodded, but kept his hand near his holster. "We're just going to ask you a few questions." Jerome carefully unbuckled his seatbelt, picked up his carry-on, and looked over at seat 2B and the father across the aisle. Both men murmured words of support. The little girl clutched a teddy bear, wide-eyed at the drama. Helen stood to the side, lips curved in a smug smile. Jerome forced himself not to speak to her. Instead, he turned to Sam. "Thank you for trying to help," he said quietly. Sam nodded, looking torn and guilty. Mona gestured for Jerome to exit the plane, the officers flanking him. Jerome's mind spun with the irony of it. A top investor in Delta Airlines, being escorted off a Delta plane under suspicion, courtesy of a prejudiced flight attendant. Passengers in business and economy craned their necks, some filming as the group disembarked. The airbridge felt hot and claustrophobic. They led him toward the terminal, and Jerome braced for the next stage of this ordeal. They didn't handcuff him, which was some small consolation. Mona led Jerome into a private lounge area near the arrivals gate. The officers stood by the door. She gestured for Jerome to sit. He placed his carry-on next to him, hands clasped. Mona took a seat across from him, scanning a tablet. "I'm the on-call security manager for Delta at LAX," Mona began. "Helen, the flight attendant, reported that you were disruptive, refused to follow crew member instructions, and physically obstructed her in the aisle. She alleged you caused her to fall, endangering her during turbulence." Jerome shook his head in disbelief. "That's a twisted version of events. I was helping a child pick up her toy that rolled into the aisle. Helen wasn't watching where she was going and tripped. Before that, she harassed me repeatedly, accusing me of suspicious behavior for simply using my phone and tablet. She tried to force me to show ID without cause." Mona raised an eyebrow. "Do you have any witnesses?" "Yes. The father of the child, the passenger in seat 2B, and the other flight attendant, Sam. They can all confirm that Helen was the aggressor." Mona nodded, making notes. "I'll interview them as well. May I see your ID, please?" Jerome retrieved his driver's license again. Mona compared it to the passenger manifest on her tablet. "All right, Mr. Carter. Your story will be taken into account." Jerome decided it was time to reveal his full status. "I'm also not just any passenger. I'm Jerome Carter, the largest private investor in Delta Airlines. I'm scheduled for a meeting with Delta executives today. You can confirm that." A flash of surprise crossed Mona's face. "Mr. Carter?" The same Jerome Carter who holds a significant share in the corporation. Jerome gave a single nod. Yes. Mona pressed her lips together, clearly unsettled by this revelation. She tapped on her tablet, presumably looking up internal data or verifying the details. After a moment, she looked back at him, expression more respectful. I see. Well, that certainly changes the context. I apologize on behalf of Delta for any undue stress. We will conduct a thorough investigation into Helen's conduct. Jerome drew a shaky breath. I appreciate that. But this has gone beyond stress. Helen's actions were discriminatory and reckless. She humiliated me publicly, escalated the situation, and lied about me assaulting her. This is unacceptable. Whether I'm an investor, a passenger, or anyone else, I want immediate action taken. Mona nodded firmly. Understood, Mr. Carter. Let me just gather statements from the witnesses. The police officers are here as a precaution because Helen made claims about potential violence. Once we speak to the witnesses, if there's no evidence of wrongdoing on your part and based on your ID and the passenger manifest, it's clear you belong on that flight. You're free to go. Jerome inhaled deeply, relief mixing with the lingering anger. Thank you. Mona left him with the officers, who asked a few routine questions about whether Jerome had any weapons he did not or engaged in threatening behavior he had not. They seemed to realize quickly that the situation was not matching Helen's dramatic accusations. One of them stepped out to contact his supervisor. Another murmured quietly that they just needed to follow protocol. Time dragged on while Mona interviewed Sam, seat 2B, the father, and presumably others. Jerome felt a swirl of emotions: anger, exhaustion, indignation. He texted Melissa, explaining he might be late. She responded with shock and outrage, promising to help in any way possible. He also drafted a text to a high-level Delta executive he knew personally, but he hesitated to send it. Let the chain of command handle this first, he decided. Finally, Mona returned. She seemed decisive. Mr. Carter, we've interviewed multiple witnesses. Their statements support your account. Sam, in particular, corroborates that you did not provoke or threaten Helen at any point. The father states you were assisting with his child's belongings when Helen tripped. The passenger in seat 2B confirms your calm demeanor throughout the flight. Jerome exhaled. Thank you. Mona's tone carried an undercurrent of apology. You're free to go. The officers have determined there's no basis for charges. Again, on behalf of Delta Airlines, we're very sorry for this experience. Helen has been taken off duty pending a full investigation by our human resources and corporate ethics teams. The police officers nodded, stepping away. The tension in Jerome's shoulders loosened as the ordeal came to a close. Mona rose, and Jerome stood as well. If you'd like, Mona added, I can escort you to a quiet area or your next appointment. We also have a VIP lounge available. Jerome shook his head. I have a meeting off-site, but I will be in touch with the highest levels of Delta management. I expect accountability. Mona offered her hand. Jerome hesitated, then shook it, appreciating at least the sincerity in her eyes. Of course, she said. We take this very seriously. Jerome walked out of the lounge, carry-on in hand, heart still pounding from the confrontation. In the terminal, he was greeted by a flurry of onlookers. Some recognized him, some were just curious about the group of officers who'd escorted a first-class passenger off the plane. He ignored the stares, forging a path through the terminal with measured steps. News travels fast, especially in the age of smartphones and viral videos. By the time Jerome reached his hotel in Los Angeles, a clip of him being escorted off the plane was already circulating on social media. The footage, captured by multiple passengers, showed a composed Jerome walking beside law enforcement, as well as snatches of conversation describing how Helen had singled him out. People on social media were outraged at the clear racism, the abuse of authority, and the humiliation inflicted on a prominent black businessman. The father from seat 3A even posted a brief account of the incident, praising Jerome's calm demeanor and condemning Helen's behavior as biased and reckless. Within hours, the story trended under hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #DeltaInvestorIncident. Delta Airlines' public relations team scrambled. By the time Jerome reached the meeting with the Delta executives, held at a high-rise suite in downtown Los Angeles, the CEO, CFO, and several board members were already in crisis mode. The planned agenda about route expansions and operational efficiencies was overshadowed by the scandal unfolding online. A press statement had to be drafted, an apology considered, and swift internal action taken. Jerome arrived at the boardroom with his head held high, still furious. The moment he entered, a hush fell. The CEO, a measured, intelligent leader named Carlos Gutierrez, approached him immediately. "Mr. Carter, I'm so sorry about what happened on your flight," Gutierrez said, extending his hand. "We just received the official preliminary report. We're all horrified that you were treated in such a way by one of our staff." Jerome shook his hand firmly. "I want to know exactly how you plan to address this. I've worked with Delta for years, believing in the company's values and potential. Yet today, one of your flight attendants racially profiled me, lied to security, and caused me public humiliation." Gutierrez's expression was grave. "Helen has been suspended pending an investigation. We're issuing a statement condemning discrimination and offering a personal apology to you, as well as to any passengers who felt endangered by the situation. We understand this is bigger than a single incident." Jerome took a seat at the large table. Other executives murmured greetings, but the mood was tense. He inhaled, scanning their faces. Some looked genuinely mortified, others anxious about the PR fallout. "I fought my entire career to overcome barriers," Jerome said, voice shaking with pent-up emotion. "I didn't expect to face such blatant racism from the airline I've invested in so heavily. This situation is not only damaging to me personally, but to Delta's reputation. If the airline truly stands for diversity and inclusion, you have to do more than just discipline one employee." "This is a wake-up call," Gutierrez nodded. "We agree. We're going to cooperate fully with any external investigations, and we plan to announce mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, effective immediately. We're also revisiting our policies on flight attendant authority to ensure that such abuses don't happen again. Additionally, we'd value your input on how to create a more inclusive culture moving forward." Jerome's anger simmered, but he recognized the sincerity in the CEO's words. He knew Delta had, in recent years, invested in diversity initiatives. He'd even recommended some. But Helen's behavior proved that training and policies only worked if employees truly embraced them. The meeting shifted gears into crisis management mode. They drafted a statement that would be released to the public. Jerome insisted on transparency, that Delta acknowledge the incident of racial profiling, apologize unequivocally, and outline concrete steps for change. The executives agreed. They also discussed a possible press conference where Jerome and Gutierrez would jointly address the situation, turning it into a moment of accountability and progress rather than a silent cover-up. By the end of the discussion, Jerome felt emotionally drained but somewhat reassured. He had demanded accountability, and the airline's leadership appeared genuinely willing to make amends. The final question remained, what about Helen? Gutierrez spoke quietly. HR will handle the termination process if the investigation confirms wrongdoing. Based on the witness statements, it's almost certain, but she'll have due process. As is standard, Jerome nodded. He didn't relish the thought of someone losing their job, but Helen's malicious intent had been clear. She had endangered him, the other passengers, and the airline's integrity. Actions had consequences. Chapters 14 and 15 combined, twists of karma and a new beginning, 500 words. Word spread quickly after Jerome Carter's forced escort off the plane. Passengers who had witnessed the incident took to social media, sharing videos and first-hand accounts of flight attendant Helen's hostile behavior. Public outrage grew, especially when they discovered that Jerome was no ordinary traveler, but a key investor in Delta Airlines. Within hours, hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #DeltaInvestorIncident trended worldwide, and pressure mounted for Delta to take action. As HR investigated, more details about Helen's past emerged. Several former passengers and co-workers described incidents of rude or biased treatment. Although she had been warned about her behavior, this time Helen's actions were undeniable and widely publicized. Delta promptly suspended her, pending a final decision. Meanwhile, Jerome received waves of support, from regular travelers to leading figures in the business and civil rights communities. His calm response in the face of blatant discrimination only enhanced his reputation. People admired that he used this ordeal to call for deeper systemic change. Soon after, Delta announced that Helen had been terminated. In a statement, the airline declared it would not tolerate discrimination, adding that prejudice has no seat on our flights. Jerome, while relieved to see some accountability, remained focused on ensuring that broader lessons were learned. He pledged to work with Delta's top executives to drive meaningful reforms, especially around training and oversight. 2 weeks later, Jerome and Delta CEO Carlos Gutierrez appeared side by side at a press conference in Los Angeles. Journalists grilled them about the incident, the subsequent backlash, and the airline's corrective measures. Carlos outlined the introduction of mandatory anti-bias training for all employees, tighter reporting systems for misconduct, and the formation of an advisory council to oversee inclusivity, one that Jerome agreed to join. Jerome addressed the media with calm determination. He emphasized that this incident was about more than a single flight or a single employee. It underscored the importance of dismantling prejudice wherever it appeared. Though he acknowledged he was grateful for the swift support he'd received, he also recognized many others have endured similar mistreatment without the advantage of visibility or influence. He hoped Delta's response would serve as a model for other companies. At the end of the press conference, Jerome quietly reflected on his journey. He had initially boarded that plane expecting a routine flight, but instead found himself in the center of a national conversation. While it was undeniably painful to have been humiliated, the outcome offered a chance for genuine growth, both for Delta Airlines and for the countless people who recognized their own experiences in his story. As he finally boarded a return flight to New York, Jerome was met with warm smiles from the flight crew. This time, he felt hope that, through accountability and courage, even the most turbulent flights could lead to a safer, fairer landing for everyone. Sometimes, life tosses unexpected turbulence our way, forcing us to confront injustice head-on. Jerome Carter's ordeal wasn't just another moment. It was a powerful wake-up call about deep-rooted biases. One prejudiced flight attendant put everything at risk: his dignity, his reputation, even Delta's standing. But Jerome's courage, coupled with the airline's leadership stepping up, turned a potential tragedy into a transformative moment. Policies changed, employees underwent renewed training, and a dialogue opened about what it truly means to serve all passengers with respect. Now it's your turn to help the message spread. If Jerome's story moved you or angered you, please take a moment to hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to this channel for more eye-opening stories. Because every time we shine a spotlight on discrimination, we take one step closer to the world we all deserve, a world where everyone can soar without limits.